The application development ecosystem is fragmented. In recent years, the Dart programming language has begun to present a solution to this fragmentation. The Dart programming language can be used to build mobile apps for both iOS and Android. In addition to mobile apps, Dart can be used to build web applications, desktop applications, and also backend API services. This is in contrast to the patchwork of technologies that typically would be required. We are beginning to see the unification of software development leading to higher productivity for development teams. Dart is still a fairly young programming language and is far from being mainstream, but a few early adopters noticed its potential and began producing tutorials and software libraries to support the Dart developer community. One such early adopter is Jermaine Oppong. Jermaine is the founder of Creative Bracket, a popular YouTube channel and blog dedicated to educating developers on the Dart programming language. Today, I welcome Jermaine on the show to discuss his experience with Dart, what he has learned, and where he sees this all going. Hi, Jermaine. Welcome to the Dart Developer Show.
Thank you for having me, Dalisa.
There are a lot of topics that we want to cover today, but before we jump into your work with the Dart programming language, tell us a bit about your background and how you got into software development.
Yeah, sure. So before I got into software development, I was pretty much a graphic designer, or I was studying graphic design in college. During that time, my friends had enrolled on this project, which was supposed to teach them web design. At least that's what they said. But then they had been given a brief, and then they were told to, go build a website essentially. So they turned to me to help them. And during that time, I knew nothing about HTML, CSS, how the web worked and whatnot. I was aware that, like Dreamweaver existed and those kind of tools. I think during those times, there were a lot of those tools that you would use to build websites yourself. So I downloaded one of those tools. I did some search online, and then I used that tool to put together a website. But during the development of that website, it got to a time where I needed that tool to do certain things, and it wasn't doing it. During that time, I wasn't aware of the differences between browsers and how things were rendered. I thought it was down to the tool. So it was my frustrations during that time that the tool wasn't doing what I wanted it to do, and I didn't know that much HTML and CSS. In fact, I didn't know it at all. Was my frustrations from there. That's what made me, after the website got live, I went to the library and I got a book on HTML, which is Sam's Teach Yourself HTML in 24 hours. So I learned from there essentially. And I did some freelance gigs during that time. So from 2006 to 2010, when I graduated, and then I got my first job as a web designer / developer. And yeah, I've pretty much sort of remained consistent through the years.
That's an awesome story. I think that's the great thing about the web is that you can have an interest and just continue to explore and figure stuff out. I remember using Dreamweaver. I think the first thing I used was Front Page from Microsoft. It was kind of like Microsoft Word, and then you could save it as an HTML. At the time, it was amazing. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for telling us how you got into software development. And then at some point, you decided that you needed to learn about the Dart programming language. Tell us a bit about the series of events that led you to discovering Dart, and what were some of the issues that you were facing that Dart looked like it could help you with.
Yeah, so during the early days of me learning HTML, CSS, I tried learning JavaScript. But I found it very difficult. like in the first stages of picking up JavaScript. I remember, so I avoided it for quite a long time. So I'll do HTML, I'll do CSS, and then funny enough, I picked up PHP because I learned also during that time that my cousin also is a web developer. So I'd learned a lot from him, and he was doing PHP during that time. So I picked up PHP. I was doing some, WordPress templates, WordPress themes, and that kind of stuff for clients and whatnot. And then as time went on, I stumbled upon jQuery because of my cousin and started learning a little bit of jQuery. In 2010, I got my first job as a web developer slash designer. So it was sort of like 50% design, 50% development. I was still able to use, my graphic design skills during that time. And during the job, it so happened that the interfaces we're building required a lot of JavaScript. So during those 2 years, I dived a little bit more into JavaScript, not raw JavaScript, but more through jQuery because that's what I was familiar with. As time went on, I um, began to feel the need to dive in more into the language itself. So that's when I started learning more about JavaScript itself, so prototypes, inheritance, and whatnot. Fast forward to 2013, 2012, 2013, I um, began to come across object-oriented programming concepts. So I was trying to learn that, but um, during that time, JavaScript did not have the concept of classes and interfaces, at least not in the traditional sense, because I was working for a company where, by it was a software house, and there were like 25, at least 25 to 30 um, backend developers, and they were all like C sharp developers. So in terms of object-oriented programming, they were pretty much doing that all the time. It was just myself and another guy who were the only front-end guys there. But during that time, I was looking to upskill myself to improve my programming skills, essentially. Um, I wanted to learn an object-oriented programming language. I looked at C Sharp briefly, but then I found it quite difficult to pick up because it was just I found that it was just too much ceremony surrounding the language, and for someone who still considered himself quite young in the world of programming, it was very difficult to sort of pick that up and get the ball rolling as quickly as possible. So during that time, dabbling, like sort of looking briefly at C Sharp. Of course, also I was deep into JavaScript during that time, but then I was like a bit, what's the word? I was sad that, though JavaScript was nice to work in, it didn't have, all those concepts that the backend developers had, like classes, interfaces, static typing, and whatnot, because I saw them working with it and I saw the benefits they were experiencing from that. JavaScript didn't have that. So lo and behold, 2013, while looking around, I stumbled upon Dart. Also because Google were beginning to talk about it a bit more, and also during that time, I think TypeScript had also come out. So of course, there was the discussion between Dart versus JavaScript, and um, also there were conversations around the problems with the JavaScript language and the length of time you have to wait for language features to get standardized because it's not traditionally open source. So if you need to bring any new features in the JavaScript language, it has to go through this whole standardization process. And the team who worked on Dart created Dart essentially out of the frustrations they experienced while working on the V8 JavaScript engine for Chrome. So, of course, they could have made suggestions to improve the JavaScript language, but that would have taken just years of back and forth. And to avoid that, they decided to just go ahead and create the Dart language. But I encountered Dart because they were giving presentations there, and it was, people were talking about it. And I just remember my first experience with it, just using the classes, using interfaces and whatnot. It was just so easy to get into it. I had such a productive experience working with it. I even went as far as giving a presentation on it to the backend devs there at work as well. And it was just through there that I began to appreciate what the team were doing with the language itself. So it was in 2013 I first heard about it, and I was just happy with just the whole ecosystem in general, just the tools that were available, because it wasn't just the language. You get a VM, you get a formatting tool, you get documentation generator, and so on and so forth. And I was just so pleased with that. So yeah, it was just from there. That was pretty much like when I first heard about it in 2013, and yeah, it was just such an enjoyable experience.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing because it sounds like you were one of the early adopters for Dart. From what I can tell, Dart pretty much existed mostly under the radar for the first few years. In 2018, things started to pick up in terms of popularity when Flutter came along, and Dart is used by Flutter. But out of curiosity, when you explained that you went back to your colleagues at work and you told them how amazing Dart was. What was the reception? Were they skeptical? Were they, yeah, that's great, we should use this right now? What was the response?
No, I think there was a degree of skepticism with it. Some of them liked the idea of the language. There was a degree of skepticism with it because it was still early days and it was unproven. Plus also because they were C sharp devs. Another reason was the advent of TypeScript, which for them it sort of made sense because TypeScript had quite a number of similarities with C sharp because it's obviously from Microsoft. Um, a group of them did build a web app with Dart themselves. It was like what was it? It was like a map application whereby you would make notes of different burger joints around London. So a couple of them, built a project with it. But overall reception, yeah, they liked the language. They just didn't think it would last that long. At least some of them didn't think it would last that long. Um, which I guess to a degree, I guess to a degree they were right. But then obviously as
Right,
time went
exactly.
on, yeah, as time went on, now Dart is obviously one of the most loved languages. But yeah, I think during that time, because there wasn't so much people jumping on board due to TypeScript and also the advent of and also ES6 also picking up during that time. So of course, because people were um, already familiar with JavaScript, it made sense to go down the ES6 route, and because also TypeScript built on top of JavaScript was already there, people were going down that direction. I guess it made sense during that time to go down that direction a bit more.
Yeah, I can definitely see that perspective. What was it that led you to stick with Dart during that time?
So during that time, I mean, I played with Dart like a little bit like afterwards, but I did sort of this like not touch Dart for a while. So there was a season whereby I didn't touch Dart because it looked like the team weren't working on it that much or weren't pushing it that much. So there was like a period of a couple of years whereby I didn't I didn't touch the language. Also, ES6 was becoming quite big, so I essentially got into that a bit more, mostly because they were beginning to introduce some of the concepts that backend guys had, so like classes, for instance, and imports and all that stuff. So I mean, JavaScript, I guess you could say, became exciting for me again. So I stuck with that for a couple of years. But then it was in 2017 that I came across, the presentation on the Sky framework, which would later become Flutter, and it kind of made me decide to take another look into Dart itself. Um, and also, what else can I say about that? Also, during that time, I had also sort of began to develop a bit of fatigue for the JavaScript language, because a lot of things began to just feel too predictable. So it was 2017, 2018, I decided to take another look into that and go much deeper into it.
I had no idea that Flutter was called the Sky framework before, so that's an interesting thing to note. So it was around 2017, 2018, you started to pick up Dart again, and it was around this time when you started posting tutorials. So your tutorials on YouTube, I think, started in 2018. What was the impetus to create these resources for people on Dart?
Yeah. So what made me go in that direction was, I mean, Flutter was becoming, um, well, people were encountering Flutter, and of course, they were, um, talking about how great it is and whatnot. But then I wanted to highlight the fact that what makes Flutter great is the underlying language, which is Dart, essentially. So from there, I began to ask myself, what would be the main hindrance stopping people from adopting the Dart language during that time? And it came down to documentation for it, because I had also stumbled upon some comments, that people were making, saying that, it's hard to find documentation for this. How do you do X? How do you do Y? So I planned that I would look at the tutorials that people usually would look for when exploring like a framework like Node.js, for instance. So, building a to-do app, building REST APIs and whatnot. And I decided I was going to use that as a blueprint to produce content on Dart itself. Because what was lacking predominantly was content around it. How do I use the framework? How do I use the tools available? Um, which I felt not, which I felt there wasn't like much on that. So that was the strategy I decided to adopt when exploring that, and I'm still continuing to do that because I still think that there is more content that can be produced for it. I mean, now fortunately there is a lot of content on Flutter itself, but I think what would be great is having also content on the Dart language itself, that to the point that people also be motivated to use Dart across the stack, so not just as a client based language, but also as a backend and full stack essentially, which is what I've been teaching so far.
Yeah, it's great. And it's great that you mentioned about full stack development. So what I'd like to do now is change gears a bit and start to cover some of the different technologies, platforms that Dart operates on. So we know that Dart is the underlying language for Flutter, but Dart can also be used for single page web apps via the Angular Dart framework. And then it can also be used to create backend servers using frameworks like Aqueduct and Angel. Maybe let's start off with one of those. Let's say Aqueduct. Can you talk about how that helps to create backend servers and what your experience has been?
Yeah, so Aqueduct is created by a team of developers at a company called Stable Kernel, I believe. So Aqueduct first came out, I believe, 2016, 2017. So I first saw a presentation by the CEO, Joe Conway. So the idea of Aqueduct is, yeah, essentially a framework for building server-side applications. They took a lot of inspiration from ASP.NET MVC. So with Aqueduct, it comes with an ORM for talking to a Postgres database. It's got sort of resource. It's got different like classes for doing different things. So file controllers, classes for creating routers, classes for managing resources. So it's all like REST based framework. You can also generate. It's also got like Open API um, um, support. So if you're familiar with Swagger, you can generate like Swagger documentation from your APIs and whatnot. So it's like my experiences with it, I found it quite robust as a framework for building like full blown server side backends, and it's got quite some good features if you want to build like backend applications that will last for the long term. And of course, you're able to it also supports multi-threading by using Dart's isolate features. So me reading through all of that media documentation and experimenting with the examples just made me decide to create some content on it and at least give it a bit more exposure, so that people pick it up for their projects.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And in your experience, how solid would you say Dart is for use in the back end? Like, would you use it on a production solution?
Yeah, I personally would. I mean, there are some people I've come across that are using Dart across the stack. So Angular Dart on front end and Dart on the back end. There are some Reddit um, discussions on that, and there are people also in the GitHub community that have been using Dart across the stack. Um, so one of the good things about the Dart SDK itself, so minus the packages, is that it comes with like a lot of classes, a lot of helper and utility classes for doing various things. So if you need to create a server, for instance, there's a class for that. If you need like base 64 encoding, there are classes for that. There are just loads of classes that come within the Dart SDK itself. So even if there were no packages, there is enough within the SDK toolset for you to construct your own servers, to build your own backend applications. Um, Also, companies are beginning to pick it up. So companies like AWS, who a couple of months ago decided to build a custom runtime which allows you to run Dart as a Lambda function, essentially. So, and that is also ready for production. That's like at version 1.0. But in answer to the question, there are enough classes and utilities for building these sorts of applications. So I'll say that is quite reliable. But right now, it just needs a bit more exposure on what's possible with it.
Right. Okay. And definitely the content that you're creating is definitely helping to produce a lot of that exposure. So maybe let's move on to one of the other backend frameworks. There's another called the Angel framework. So I think it has, in terms of its application, it's kind of very similar to Aqueduct, but it's probably different slightly in how it implements the backend servers. Maybe can you tell us a bit about your experience with the Angel framework?
Yeah. So with the Angel framework, it's got a lot of inspiration from the Express library. Um, so Express.js, that's from Node.js. So while Aqueduct, I guess they focus more on like using classes to describe your REST APIs and stuff like that. With Angel, is in a more a functional format. So the way you set it up is very similar to Express JS. So you'd create an Angel object, and from there you're able to do like app.get, app.post, app.put, and so on and so forth. It also does multi-threading. It's got I guess the good thing about Angel is that it has a lot of integrations with different things. So it's got loads of packages for different things. So whether you're doing WebSockets, you want to work with MongoDB, PostgreSQL, you want to do templating, there are loads of support. And there's a lot of packages out there that does it. Um, However, though, Angel is developed by a student called Toby Sakwe. So he's a student working on it, and he's pretty much sort of built that out himself and worked on that. So that's also production quality. I guess in the case with Aqueduct, there is there's more of a team of people working on it. Angel is predominantly Toby, although he does get contributions here and there, but it's predominantly Toby working on it. But in terms of the differences, Angel takes a more functional approach to building servers and and whatnot, and Aqueduct is more sort of like classes and interfaces and whatnot.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for taking us through that. I took a quick look at the Angel framework as well, and one thing that was very nice that I saw is that it had the template in engine
Yeah,
in case you wanted to build, in case you wanted to have the server rendered pages. That I thought that was useful.
yeah. Also, I'll say the learning curve as well is much easier with Angel than Aqueduct. I think you can build things much more quickly using Angel than with Aqueduct. So, for instance, with Aqueduct, if you need templating, you would have to sort of piece it together yourself and figure out a pattern that works. But with Angel, because it's got a templating package as part of it, it's easier to sort of integrate that. It's worth mentioning.
So I guess moving up the stack. So with that, you can build your backend. You can connect to a database, whether it's Postgres or Mongo or any other database that you want. And then on the front end, there's Angular Dot, and Angular Dot is based on the name inspired from Angular, the Angular single page app framework. Maybe for the benefit of those who haven't used it, take us through what Angular Dot is and how similar it is to the Angular JS variant of it.
Yeah. So, like you said, yeah, Angular Dart is essentially a framework for building single page web apps. So it is based on Angular JS, but I'll say mostly Angular TypeScript because Angular JS version 1 and version 2 were drastically different. So with version 2, the Angular team decided to go with TypeScript and essentially start developing from there. So when Angular Dart came out, it was based heavily on Angular TypeScript. So you find that there are similarities between the two. There might be differences in the way certain things are named. Um, for instance, like how you declare a component. I think with them it's ng module or something. I don't know. I haven't looked too much into the TypeScript variant. Um, but then I think version 5, I think from version 5, the teams began to diverge a little bit. So Angular Dart focuses heavily on using code generation behind the scenes. Um, I don't know how the TypeScript one works like. So sometimes I find that if I need to learn something in, Angular Dart, and I can't find enough docs for it, sometimes I go and I look at the Angular TypeScript docs, and then I find that I'm able to easily translate that into Angular Dart. Um, so I mean, yeah. So it's essentially a single page application, it's very similar with the Angular TypeScript versions. I'll say the differences are pretty slim right now.
So in terms of if I was an Angular developer, it'll be pretty straightforward. I would feel right at home if I decided to start using Angular Dart. That's how it sounds.
Yeah, most of the concepts will be similar. It will be similar. You'll be familiar with most of the concepts in there. Um, but of course, there'll be differences, but it wouldn't be like it's not, I don't think it's too many differences at the moment. Well, like I said, I haven't used Angular TypeScript a lot, so I don't know, probably it's changed right now. The last time I checked, I think they're on version 9 or something like that. Angular Dart is still around version 6, at least version 6 alpha. So yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell you exactly. But for the most part, like the basic like concepts of it, components, directives, services, they'll be pretty similar.
So we're still on the front end. We looked at Angular Dart. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about Flutter and really just about its goals, because it's quite an ambitious project in terms of its goals. So I was listening to an interview that one of the founders, and their goal is to make Flutter the way to build user interfaces or UIs on any surface. So it could be your mobile phone, it could be a web page, it could be a desktop, it could be a smart sign somewhere, it could be an IoT device. So it's very broad in terms of its ambition and goals. Right now, it's running. You can use it to build mobile apps, and they've released some early versions of the Flutter Web, and then also eventually Flutter Desktop. How much time have you spent using Flutter and trying out some of these different platforms that it's targeting?
Yeah. So with Flutter, I have been looking at it a lot more lately. Um, Mostly because, well, first because for my benefit, because I know it's quite big right now, and it's the main way that people are working with Dart itself. I got like one or two tutorials out on YouTube on that. Also, I'm working with an organization, two organizations that are creating a couple of Flutter workshops. So lately, I've been, yeah, highly, um, how do you say, highly invested in it, learning about it. Also, because I've used React on the front end quite a lot. I've seen the similarities between the two, so it's been yeah, easy to pick up from there. I I think as the farthest I went with Flutter was I built a game with it, so it's like a tile matching game on my phone. So it's got some routing. It uses some of Flutter's inbuilt widgets, the rows and columns and the grid view systems, and does some simple state management. Um, so it's not been like too in depth at this present moment. I think I've just skimmed the surface with it. So I've just experimented with the mobile and the web versions of it. So I haven't touched on desktop or Linux environment and that kind of stuff.
And the web, so web is quite interesting in the sense that eventually, if this works, Flutter could be a language for building web applications. In when you're building your game, did you try and target the web as a platform?
No, so I was predominantly targeting mobile because during that time, Flutter Web wasn't too big a thing. So that was before December 2018 when the Dart team announced at the Science Museum that they were bringing it to the web, bringing Flutter to the web. It was called the Hummingbird project during that time. So I did try, like, on one occasion to just compile what I had done for the web, but I didn't go too far with it because it was still early days, and yeah, it was it was super slow. Um, but I mean, now, I mean, Flutter Web is much more faster. In fact, I'm thinking of doing this app again, um, building it from scratch and using one of the state management solutions that have been recommended by the Flutter team. Um, but yeah, it was mostly on my mobile Android device. That was the easiest I could do during that time.
It's definitely a very exciting space to watch. It seems almost every day something new is being announced. The other day, I saw a news item about how the Flutter team are collaborating with Canonical, who
Yeah,
are the team behind the Ubuntu Linux operating system,
yeah,
and they're gonna work together to make sure that developers can target Linux and specifically, I think the Snap Store, which is it's kind of like the App Store for Linux. So that's really exciting, and and I think it's exciting because it could bring new life to some of these platforms that right now seem a bit older. For example, Windows, I think, has struggled to be an operating system for some of these new touch interfaces. So you have the Surface line of tablets, but there aren't that many apps that you can use for it in the touch interface. So I think it's very exciting. I think if I was Microsoft and obviously Linux behind it, I would really be putting a lot of effort into trying to make it work because it could breathe a whole new life into these platforms.
yeah, most definitely. I also came across an article whereby Google were encouraging Microsoft to adopt Flutter to, I guess, help improve the ecosystem. I know the Surface team have been experimenting with Flutter itself. Um, and yeah, I've seen some examples with that. So I think, yeah, Flutter is definitely going along the right directions. And, we're seeing more people adopting it as the days go by. Um, and also, yeah, and I think the adoption, obviously, it's testament that Flutter is definitely one of the best innovations that we're experiencing in today's world, at least for the tech community.
Yeah, definitely. So we're coming up towards the end of the podcast. There are a couple more questions that I wanted to ask. So this is more about the some of the new things that are coming up in the Dart language. Particularly, there's one big item that a lot of people are talking about, which is null safety.
Mm.
So null safety, I think it's in a lot of newer languages now. It hasn't been in Dart, and they're bringing it in. Maybe for the sake of those in the audience who are unfamiliar with this, could you give us a description of what null safety is and why it's important?
Yeah. So my basic understanding of it, null safety is essentially a mechanism that is there to ensure that how do you say, there's a mechanism there to ensure that you are effectively looking out for values that could potentially become null in your program. So sometimes you would write these functions whereby um, you're expecting arguments to be passed in, and then because you're not writing logic to check for null, because you're not writing logic to check for the null keyword to be passed in, sometimes null can get passed in, and because you're not actually listening or checking for that, it could cause your program to break. So the idea behind null safety is to give you that extra security when writing your software, so you're able to detect when null gets passed in.
Right. Thanks for that. And just to give the listeners some more context around it, the person who was one of the early pioneers in programming languages, Tony Hoare, he introduced the concept of null when he was building the language Algol back in the 60s. And when he reflects on it, he calls it his $1 billion mistake, because it's caused so much problems in programming over the years that he thinks it's caused at least $1 billion of mistakes. So I think it's great that we're beginning to have more safety in this area, and looking forward to seeing the next version of Dart that has that integrated into it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what he just said, because even in my own programs I'm writing, I'm finding myself having to literally just write extra logic, to check for nulls, because I know that if it ever gets passed in, my program will break. So at least this safety, helps to protect against that, and it saves you also from writing that extra logic.
So before we leave, I have a couple more questions. One is, since you've been creating content for a couple of years now on YouTube and different channels, I think you also have an ebook that you published. What are some of the lessons that you've learned over this time being a content producer?
Some of the lessons I've learned is, one is around consistency. So consistency is key with creating out this content. I used to sort of create like something today, and then after maybe I wouldn't produce something else in the next 6 weeks and whatnot. So I think consistency is key, always having content out that is also relevant to what people are asking. So I constantly listen to what people are suggesting, what content they would like to see. So right now I'm doing an Angular Dart and Aqueduct series on YouTube. So I've got 5 videos out right now. So that covers the whole spectrum from front end to back end. And that was because a lot of people have been asking for that. They wanted to see how a Dart application that works on front end and back end would look like. So one is consistency. Two, also is listening to what the users want, and responding to that. The third one I'd say is also I'm pretty much playing the long game with this one, because I know it'll probably take maybe a couple more years till all of this catches on. But it's for anyone who wants to be a content creator, you have to be in for the long game. You can't expect to get like thousands of subscribers within this first 2 weeks or anything as such. Oh well, it depends on how viral your content is, but yeah, I'd say like being prepared for the long game would be the third thing I've learned in this.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jermaine. And how can people find your material online?
Yeah, sure. I've got got a website you can visit, creativebracket.com. It's got a link to my YouTube channel and my Twitter. page as well. I also blog on medium.com. My handle is Graphic Beacon. I blog on dev.to. My handle is also Graphic Beacon. You can reach out to me through those channels. I'm also on the Gitter Dart groups. Perhaps I can send you those links and you could share it out.
Yeah, definitely. We'll put those on the show notes for listeners. So I think that's it for today. Thanks a lot, Jermaine, for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Deliso, for having me.